I want you to understand something before I start. I'm not the kind of person who tells stories like this. I've never posted online before, never called a hotline, never even told my wife the full version of what happened out there. But it's been 14 months, and I still wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I can hear the sound of that door. That specific sound. If you've ever stood next to a submarine hatch being pressurized or a bank vault being cycled open, you'd have some frame of reference. But even that wouldn't be close. Not even close. So I'm telling it now, all of it, because I think if I don't get it out of me, I'm going to carry it to my grave. And something about that feels wrong. Something about letting it stay buried feels like exactly what they wanted. I should have left the moment I read rule number 4, but I didn't. And now, here we are. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I spent 11 years doing private security contracting, mostly overseas, mostly the kind of work you don't describe at dinner parties. Iraq twice, 1 rotation in Djibouti, a year doing facility protection in the UAE. I was good at the job because I'm not impulsive, I'm not emotional, and I have a genuinely high tolerance for boredom. That last one matters more than people think. Most security work isn't dangerous. It's just deeply, profoundly boring. And the people who can't handle the boredom are the ones who make mistakes. When I came back stateside for good, I transitioned into domestic contracting. Lower pay, but my daughter was 8 and I needed to be home. I worked through a firm called Meridian Protective Services, power substations, data centers, federal land perimeter work. The boring end of things, which was fine by me. In September of 2024, and I want to be specific about the timeline because it matters later, I was offered what Meridian calls a Class 7 posting. Remote location, single occupancy, extended duration. The paperwork described it as Legacy Infrastructure Facility Monitoring, Nevada, Perimeter Assurance 90-day term. The pay was nearly double the standard rate. When I asked my case manager, Sandra, why the rate was elevated, she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "The location is isolated. They want someone who won't need things." I didn't ask what that meant. I should have. The drive from Las Vegas took about 2.5 hours, and for the last 45 minutes of it, I was on a road that didn't appear on my GPS. Not a road the GPS flagged as unmapped. A road that was simply not displayed. The satellite view on my phone showed flat scrubland right up until the moment I turned onto it. Cell service had already dropped out. I was navigating by printed directions Meridian had included with my contract paperwork, which out there turned out to be the only option. The desert in that part of Nevada looks nothing like what you see in movies. No drama, no orange dunes, no red formations. It's flat, pale, gray-beige scrubland, extending in every direction with low brown brush and occasional Joshua trees that look less like trees and more like something trying very hard to look like a tree. The sky is enormous. Even in daytime, it has a quality like the inside of a room that's too large. Like the scale of things is slightly wrong and your brain can't quite settle. What I found at the end of that road was a perimeter fence, 8 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, and behind it, 40 yards of flat gravel, and behind that, at the far end of the enclosed area, approximately 120 yards away, the bunker door. I didn't register it immediately as a door. From a distance, it looked like a discoloration in the earth, a flat, rectangular shape slightly different in texture from the surrounding ground. It was only when I drove forward on the gravel that I understood the scale of what I was looking at. The door was set into the ground at a shallow angle, maybe 15 degrees off horizontal. It was, and I measured this later out of simple disbelief, approximately 22 feet wide and 32 feet tall. Reinforced steel plate, the kind of thickness you'd associate with a ship's hull rather than a door. Around its outer edge was a concrete frame recessed into the earth, and there was a seam around the entire door, maybe 2 inches wide, showing the gap between the steel and the frame. I noticed, even from 40 yards away, that the seam at the top, the opening edge, appeared slightly darker than the rest, as though the air from inside had been doing something to the metal right there for a very long time, as though something had been close to that edge from the inside, pressing against it, not hard enough to move it, but consistently enough to leave a mark on the air. I parked, took my gear into the guard station, and got acquainted with the setup. Monitor and keyboard. Security panel with 12 camera feeds, 4 of which showed only static. A cot, a bathroom, a microwave, a filing cabinet, and a locker, a standard steel stand-up locker to which I had a key from my contract packet. Inside the locker, taped to the door at eye level, was a single sheet of paper, laminated, slightly yellowed at the edges, printed in a clean sans serif font, titled in bold capitals, Site Protocols, Contractor Personnel. I'm going to give you the rules exactly as I remember them, because I read that list 3 times on the first night, and I've carried every word of it since. Rule 1. Remain inside the guard station from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. Do not exit for any reason during these hours unless Rule 9 applies. Rule 2. Do not approach the bunker door closer than 40 feet during daylight hours. Do not approach within 75 feet during nighttime hours. Rule 3. If the exterior perimeter lights fail, do not attempt to restore them until daylight. Use internal lighting only. Rule 4. If you hear knocking or impact sounds from inside the bunker, do not acknowledge it in any way. Do not speak. Do not move toward it. Do not respond on any communication device. Wait until the sounds stop completely, then wait an additional 15 minutes. Rule 5. The radio will occasionally receive interference. If the interference includes recognizable speech patterns or what sounds like your own voice, turn the radio off immediately and do not turn it back on until sunrise. Rule 6. If one of the camera feeds showing the bunker door goes to static, do not attempt to restore it remotely. Do not go to the camera to inspect it. Log the time and wait. Rule 7. Do not use the exterior floodlight on the southern face of the guard station between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Rule 8. If you see movement on any camera feed that you cannot account for with a natural explanation, do not log it in the official facility report. Keep a separate personal log and note the time and description there. Rule 9. If you smell ozone inside the guard station, or if the temperature inside drops more than 10 degrees in less than 5 minutes, you are permitted to exit the guard station, regardless of the time. Move directly to your vehicle and drive to the highway. Do not stop. Do not look back at the facility. Rule 10. The bunker door will occasionally make sounds during pressure equalization events, which occur naturally and irregularly. These sounds are normal and do not require action. You will know the difference between a pressure equalization event and an actual door movement, because an actual door movement will be preceded by a distinctive clicking sequence lasting between 3 and 12 seconds. If you hear this clicking, go to Rule 11 immediately. Rule 11. If the bunker door begins to open, do not approach it. Do not go outside. Do not attempt to contact any of the emergency numbers during this event. Stay inside. Keep your eyes on the camera feed. Do not look away from the screen. Wait until the door has stopped moving. Log the time it opened and the time it stopped moving, but nothing else. And then there was Rule 12. The text was slightly smaller, formatted differently, as though it had been added by someone else after the fact. Rule 12. Whatever you think you see on the camera feed after the door opens, remember that the camera does not show everything that is there. That was the whole list. 12 rules, laminated, taped inside a locker at an unmapped location in the Nevada desert. I read it 3 times. I stood there in the early evening with the generator humming outside, and I want to tell you what I was thinking, because this matters for understanding everything that followed. I was not frightened. What I felt was professional alertness, the heightened attentiveness you develop when a job turns out to have more to it than the briefing suggested. Government-adjacent facilities operate on need-to-know structures so layered that the person at the outermost layer receives instructions without context, because context is itself classified. Unusual protocols were not unusual in my line of work. I filed the rules under unusual protocol and got on with the job. But Rule 4 bothered me in a way the others didn't. Not because of what it said exactly, but because of how specifically it said it. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't acknowledge. And then wait 15 minutes after the sounds stop. That's not a rule written for ambiguity. That's a rule written by someone who either watched things go wrong or thought very carefully about how they could. That kind of precision comes from experience, from failure. And Rule 12. I kept coming back to Rule 12. It's not an instruction. It's a statement of fact, placed deliberately at the end of a safety protocol, which means whoever wrote it found it important enough to include not to tell you what to do, but to tell you what you couldn't know. That the screen in front of you would always show you less than the truth. The first week passed with the specific texture of deep isolation that anyone who has worked solitary postings will recognize. The crunch of wind-blown gravel against the station walls. The generator's rhythm with its slight irregularity every 45 seconds. like a hiccup. The desert, going so completely silent around 2 a.m. that the silence itself starts to feel like pressure. On 3 separate occasions, I heard what Rule 10 described as pressure equalization events. A low sub-bass groan felt more than heard, traveling up through the slab floor. The kind of vibration that finds your back teeth. It would last 15 to 40 seconds and then stop, and there was never any corresponding movement on the cameras. On day 9, I had my first real indication that this posting was different. It was 1:30 in the morning. I was doing my standard camera review when I noticed something on feed 7, a perimeter camera aimed inward across the gravel field. A shape, roughly vertical, narrow, no more than 2 feet wide, and tall, perhaps 6 or 7 feet. It was darker than its surroundings on the infrared feed, which is unusual. On infrared, warm objects appear lighter. Something darker would mean something cooler than the ambient air. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds, and then it was gone. Not gone as in it moved out of frame. Gone as in it was there, and then it wasn't, between one frame and the next. I logged the time in my personal notebook per Rule 8. In 11 years of contracting, I developed a mental taxonomy of anomalies. Things with simple explanations, things that probably had simple explanations, and things that didn't fit any available framework. That last category was small. What I'd just seen went into it. Over the following days, the quality of the isolation changed. The desert light had a flattened quality, like the brightness was coming from slightly the wrong direction. The wind at night began doing something I couldn't rationalize. It would gust and then stop. Not die down gradually the way wind does. Stop completely like someone had closed a door, then start again. Wind is a fluid phenomenon with continuous variation. This was like someone turning a switch off and on, deliberately. On day 15, the radio started doing something new. I was eating dinner when it produced a burst of static, then another, and then, inside the third burst, something that was not static. I put my fork down. It lasted about 2 seconds. Rhythmic, in a way static is not, with the cadence of speech without identifiable words. The right lengths of syllables, the right rises and falls of sentence structure, but no language I could place. I turned the volume up. Another burst. Silence. Then the pattern again. Slightly clearer. And the reason it was clearer was because one sound in it was familiar. My own name. I turned the radio off. I sat very still for a long time. Rule 5 anticipated this. It was written to cover something the rule writers expected would happen. They knew this was a thing that would occur, and they found it significant enough to include in a list designed to keep whoever was reading it alive. I did not turn the radio back on until morning. On day 17, I noticed the temperature inside the guard station had been dropping at night more than it should. I started logging it every 2 hours. The pattern was consistent. From 9 p.m., the temperature would drift slowly from 68 to about 65. The heating unit would click on. Everything would stabilize. Normal operation. Except At roughly 2 a.m., on days 17, 18, and 19, there was a window of 20 to 30 minutes where the temperature dropped faster. Not drifting, dropping 2 to 3 degrees in under 5 minutes. 3 consecutive nights. Same window, same rate. Rule 9's evacuation threshold was 10 degrees in 5 minutes. I was watching 2 to 3, but the direction was right. I started sleeping with my shoes on. On day 20, the perimeter lights on the south face went out at 11:15 p.m. with no tripped breakers and no explanation. Rule 3 said not to go outside. I didn't go outside. I moved to the feeds showing the bunker door, and I watched. At 12:50 a.m., I heard the knocking. Even now, sitting at a kitchen table in Colorado 14 months later, describing this produces something I can only call a bodily memory. Every hair on every part of me standing up simultaneously. That is not an exaggeration. It is exactly what happened. The knocking came from the direction of the bunker. Not loud, but spatially precise. It pointed across the gravel field to the door with absolute clarity. And it was clearly from inside. Not something striking the exterior. The sound of something on the inner surface of that door, applying rhythmic, deliberate force to the steel. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. Then, silence. I did not speak. I did not move. I put my hands flat on the desk and stared at the camera feed and made no sound. Rule 4. The knocking came 2 more times. Same pattern. Then it stopped, and I began my 15-minute count. And during those 15 minutes, the door did not move. The feeds showed nothing. And I sat in the particular quality of cold fear that only certain experiences can produce. Not the adrenaline spike of something jumping out at you, but the slow, settling weight of understanding that you are somewhere you have very little control over, and that it has been here far longer than you have. I thought seriously about calling Sandra and requesting reassignment, but I kept returning to one word: survivable. The rules implied these events were survivable. Someone had sat in this chair before me. Someone had experienced enough of what I was experiencing to write those rules down, laminate them, leave them where the next contractor would find them. Whatever they had faced, they had survived it well enough to document a response. As long as I followed the instructions, I was presumably going to be all right. I know how that sounds now. On day 26, I found something I hadn't noticed before. I was doing a daytime exterior check on the south side of the station. The side I didn't usually access because the south face lights had been dark for 6 days, when I noticed marks on the exterior wall. At roughly chest height, horizontal, parallel, spaced about an inch apart in sets of 3, too consistent to be accidental. They ran for about 18 inches across the surface. 3 sets of them. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. 3. The paint around them hadn't oxidized into the existing surface. In the desert heat, that takes a few days at most. These were fresh, made within the last week. The south-facing wall. The The wall my cameras couldn't see. The wall 8 inches from where my cot had been. Whatever had made those marks had been that close to me while I slept. I moved the cot to the north side of the station that afternoon and stopped sleeping during the night hours entirely. The night of day 28, the knocking came again. Same pattern, but significantly louder. Loud enough that the vibration traveled through the soles of my shoes into the floor. I followed rule 4. Hands flat, eyes on the screen, no sound. And then, at the tail end of the final sequence, as the sound was fading, feet 11 showed something I had not seen before. At the very top of the door, in the seam, at the opening edge, a sliver of darkness widened. 1/4 of an inch, maybe less. The 2-inch gap grew fractionally at the top, and then returned to normal, like something pressing against the door from inside. Just once, the smallest possible test of what the door would do. The temperature in the station dropped 2 degrees in 3 minutes. After the 15-minute protocol, I called Sandra. 7 rings. Voicemail. I tried the 3 unnamed emergency numbers from the operations binder. The first 2 gave identical recordings. This number is not available at the current time. Please follow your site protocols. The third rang 4 times. Someone picked up and didn't speak. I said, "This is the contractor at the Nevada Class 7 facility. I'm calling because..." The line went dead. I sat with the phone in my hand and looked at the camera feeds and thought about Rule 9. The vehicle 60 feet away. The road back to the highway. And then I thought about the rules written by someone who had been here and survived. And I made the decision. I've gone back and forth on ever since. I stayed. Day 29 was quiet in a way that felt preparatory, the stillness before storm. Day 30, the south-facing lights came back on without any intervention from me. I hadn't touched the breaker panel. I was eating breakfast when I glanced at the feed, and there they were, full brightness, as though they'd never gone out. I logged it in my personal notebook and said nothing in the official report because I couldn't explain it, and Rule 8 applied. That evening, I went through all 12 rules again, slowly, checking each one against 30 days of experience. Every rule had been relevant. Every rule had corresponded to something I'd observed or heard or felt. The radio, the lights, the knocking, the temperature drops, the shape on feed 7. Each rule was a response to a real event documented by someone who had been here before me and found the response that kept them alive. Rule 10 said the actual door movement would be preceded by a distinctive clicking sequence. I had never heard the clicking sequence. I went to sleep at midnight, earlier than I'd been sleeping in weeks. I was asleep by 12:20. At 2:37 a.m., I woke up. I don't know what woke me. Not a sound, or not one I consciously registered. I came up out of sleep with sudden, complete clarity, the way you surface when something has made you. I sat up on the cot, put my feet on the floor, and looked at the monitor. All 12 feeds were active. The bunker door on feet 11 looked exactly as it always did. And then I heard the clicking. I have tried many times to accurately describe the sound, and I keep failing. It was not a key in a lock, not cooling metal, not electrical equipment. The closest I can get is this. Imagine a very large mechanical clock housed in a very thick metal casing, executing a single step of its gear mechanism. The sound of precisely machined components engaging under enormous force. Now, imagine that sound repeated, each iteration slightly different in pitch from the last. Not random, but not periodic either. Like a code, like something responding to a question you didn't know had been asked. I counted the clicks. 7. Over approximately 6 seconds. And then the door began to move. I need you to understand how it moved. Not fast, not dramatically. The bunker door moved the way glaciers move, with a weight and a certainty that made the concept of speed irrelevant. It moved with the authority of something that has not moved in a very long time and is now moving because it has decided to, and nothing you or I have access to was going to interrupt that decision. On feet 11, the seam at the top of the door began to widen. The sound that accompanied this was layered, a high-frequency shriek of metal on metal, long unused bearings finding their movement, a deeper groan from the hydraulic systems. A percussion element felt through the floor before it reached my ears, as though the earth itself was vibrating at some resonant frequency. And underneath all of it, below the threshold of sound and into pure sensation, something that made my vision pulse slightly at the edges. Not a sound, a pressure in the space itself. A smell came through. I don't know how. The station was sealed, cold in a different register than anything I'd encountered before. Not the clean cold of a freezer or an equipment room. Something with age in it, something organic and chemical at the same time. Neither quite either. The smell of a space that had been closed for a very long time and was now, after that long time, open. At the 6-minute mark, the rate of movement slowed. The way you ease something forward when you're not sure what's on the other side. By 10 minutes, the gap at the top of the door was nearly 3 feet. I could see the inner walls of the installation on feet 11, old concrete, darker than the outer collar, streaked with something I couldn't identify. And beyond the concrete, the darkness of the interior. Not dark the way night is dark. Dark the way the inside of something sealed for decades is dark. Absolute. A material. At 2:51 a.m., the door stopped. 14 minutes after the clicking sequence. The gap at the top was approximately 4 feet, tapering toward the hinges at the base. Enough space at the opening edge for something to pass through. Enough for that cold smell to be moving outward, which it was, a steady exhalation from whatever was below. For 12 minutes, nothing moved in that opening. And then, at 3:03 a.m., the quality of the darkness inside the gap changed. I want to be careful here and honest. I'll tell you what I saw, and I'll also tell you that I was a man who hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in several days under sustained psychological pressure, in profound isolation, in a location that had already produced things I couldn't explain. All of that is context you need to weigh what I say next. The darkness became less uniform. The depth of it shifted, like something within it had changed its distance from the camera. Like whatever was in that dark space had come closer to the threshold without crossing it. And then, at 3:06 a.m., something touched the inside edge of the door. Not from behind the steel, from the gap itself, from the space between the door and the frame, at the top of the opening where the gap was widest. Something made contact with the inner edge of the concrete frame, and feet 11 showed me the faintest movement, a pressure, a slight distortion in the infrared, gone in under a second, like fingers testing the edge, like whatever was there was checking the dimension of the opening, measuring it. I did not move. I did not breathe for what felt like a very long time. The temperature in the station read 53 degrees. It had been 68 when I went to sleep. The darkness at the threshold was watching. I am aware of how that sounds. I am telling you what I experienced. Rule 11 said to stay inside. Keep your eyes on the camera feed. Do not look away from the screen. I did not look away. I looked at my car keys on the hook by the door. I looked at the screen. I looked at the keys. And I made myself think clearly about what I knew, which was this. The rules were written by someone who had been here and survived. Following them had kept me safe through everything that had happened so far. Abandoning them now, at the worst possible moment, because I was frightened. That was exactly the kind of decision the rules were designed to prevent me from making. I stayed in the chair. At 3:14 a.m., from the opening in the bunker door, came a sound. Not knocking, nothing mechanical. A vocalization, long, sustained, with inflection. The kind of sound a voice makes when it is not quite speaking, but more than breathing. The kind of sound that contains intention. The kind of sound you make when you know someone is listening and you want them to know that you know. It lasted about 4 seconds. And then my satellite phone buzzed once on the desk. The screen showed a notification from an application that was not installed on my phone, an application I had never downloaded, had never seen before. The notification text read, "Do not go outside." The screen went dark. I did not go outside. I sat at that desk for the next 2 hours and 43 minutes with my eyes on feet 11, watching the opening and the darkness that occupied it, and the concrete frame and the absolutely still gravel field beyond. Nothing changed. The darkness held its position at the threshold. The cold held. The smell held. Whatever had touched the edge of the frame at 3:06 did not touch it again. At 5:01 a.m., the first gray light of dawn appeared at the edges of the desert. I got up, stood in front of the locker and read all 12 rules again. I had followed every one of them through everything that had happened, and whatever was in that opening had not crossed the threshold. Whether that was because of the rules, or despite them, or entirely unrelated to them, I genuinely cannot tell you. I went outside at 5:15, stood on the gravel in the pale morning light, and looked at the bunker door from the distance required by Rule 2. The door was still open. The 4-foot gap was still there. The darkness inside was still absolute. From 40 feet, I could see the opening and the concrete frame and the inner walls and the reaching black of whatever was below. I could also, from 40 feet, hear something. A frequency at the edge of perception, felt more than heard. The mechanical settling of an old structure, air circulation through underground passages, the hydraulic aftermath of a mechanism that had just operated for the first time in what might have been decades. Or something else. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't something else. I stood there for 7 minutes and went back inside. Nights 32 and 33. The door remained open. I sat at the desk and watched the feeds, and the opening held its darkness and its cold and its quality of waiting, and nothing crossed the threshold, and I followed the rules, and the desert was silent in that particular absolute way it gets when something larger than weather is affecting the air. On the night of day 34, I woke at 3:30 a.m. to clicking. Not the 7-count opening sequence. Simpler, bilateral, the mechanism running in reverse. On feet 11, the gap at the top of the door began to narrow. 4 feet to 3 to 2 to 1 inch to the standard 2-inch gap, and then a change in the sound that told me, without ambiguity, that the internal locking mechanism had re-engaged. At 3:45 a.m. on day 34, the bunker door was sealed. The temperature began to rise. 54 degrees, 60, 64, 68. The wind returned to its normal rhythm outside, everything normalizing, resetting, as though the facility had a baseline it was designed to return to, and it was returning, and the 3 nights that had just occurred were simply part of its operating cycle, something it did at intervals, for reasons that had nothing to do with my being there. I thought about that. The idea that this had happened before would happen again, and that I had been present for it the way a stone on the ground is present for a storm. On day 35, I walked to the bunker door. I walked past the 40-foot daytime limit in deliberate violation of Rule 2, and I stopped at approximately 15 feet. I want to explain why, not because it justifies it, but because I want you to understand what 35 days of this does to a person. I needed something concrete. I needed one piece of information that I'd found, not been given, not filtered through 12 rules written by someone else. So I approached. At 15 feet, I found what I was looking for. At the top edge of the door, on the inner surface of the upper concrete frame, the surface exposed during the 4-foot gap, there was a mark. Dark, nearly black, running horizontally for about 2 feet before tapering off, at a height of approximately 15 feet from the ground, the level of the upper opening edge. I knew that seam better than I knew my own reflection. I had been watching feed 11 every day for 35 days. That mark was not there before the door opened. Something had pressed against the upper concrete frame from inside and left a residue. Something that could reach 15 feet high. I backed away from the door. The gap at its widest had been 4 feet near the top of a 32-foot door. Something 15 feet tall trying to pass through a 4-foot gap is not passing through, not even close. It hadn't come through because it couldn't. And that was a very different thing than believing the threshold had held. I finished my contract. 55 more days. I know how that sounds. The rules had held through the worst of it. In the compromise calculus I was running, isolation, sleep deprivation, 35 days of accumulated strangeness. Staying with the known protocol felt safer than the chain of unpredictable decisions that leaving would set in motion. So I followed the rules, and I waited. The last 55 days. On day 41, feed 9, one of the static feeds I'd been told not to worry about, came online for 90 seconds and showed what appeared to be a corridor deep below the facility, lit in a greenish light that was not infrared. At the far end of the corridor was a second door, smaller than the main bunker door, made of the same steel. On that door there was a symbol I couldn't identify, circular with internal geometry, and then the feed returned to static. On day 56, the official facility log was missing from my desk. I found it 2 days later inside the locked filing cabinet. The last 22 days of entries had been replaced by blank pages. On day 73, the 333 knocking came again and was followed by something new, a single additional knock after the final sequence, alone in the silence, and I waited 20 minutes instead of 15 without being entirely sure why. On day 80, the generator failed for 4 hours at midnight. During that failure, at around 2 a.m., I heard clicking. Short, 3 or 4 counts, not the full sequence, the sound of something testing the mechanism. Something below, aware the power was out, checking whether the door would respond. The generator came back on. The door was still closed. On day 89, 1 day before my contract ended, I found a piece of paper behind the first aid kit on the top shelf of the locker. I had opened that locker dozens of times. I had never seen this before. Handwritten on a torn piece of lined paper in small, careful writing that had urgency in every stroke. It said, "It knows you're there. It has always known. The rules don't protect you. They just make you predictable. Something predictable is something that can be studied. You are not a guard. Think about what that means." I stood there and held that piece of paper and let everything reorganize. The doubled pay rate, the single occupancy requirement. Sandra saying they want someone who won't need things, not someone reliable, someone who won't need things, someone who will stay. The 4 camera feeds static from day 1, feeds I'd been told not to worry about. The official log entries replaced with blank pages. The corridor feed that showed me a second door I was never told existed. The equipment in the guard station feeding not just to my monitor, but I now understood with complete certainty, to someone else's monitor, somewhere else entirely. The emergency numbers connecting to recordings. The phone notification from an app that had never been installed. Whoever was watching me knew which rules I might be tempted to break and had written instructions to prevent it. 90 days of a single consistent presence within 120 yards of a sealed bunker door. Awake during the night hours, following a predictable protocol. A fixed data point in a controlled environment. Not monitoring the facility, being monitored by it. I left on day 90 at first light, took my personal notebook, and left everything else, the binder, the rule sheet, the handwritten note, and drove out without stopping, without looking in the rearview mirror, with nothing in my head except the height of that mark and the sound of something testing the mechanism in the dark. 2 weeks later, Sandra's supervisor called to process my final payment. Normal. Professional. I asked if he could tell me anything about the facility. He said he didn't have that information. I asked if any contractors had been placed there before me. He said he wasn't able to speak to specific assignment history. I asked if anyone had read the rule sheet before placing a contractor at that facility. The rule sheet is a standard site document, he said. Every contractor reviews it at orientation. And Rule 12, I said. The camera doesn't show everything that's there. Do you know what that refers to? A pause. Not the pause of confusion. Not the pause of someone searching their memory. The specific, deliberate pause of a person who recognizes a reference and has decided, for reasons they're not sharing, not to engage with it. I'm not the right person to answer that, he said. Have a good day. He hung up. My wife tells me I talk in my sleep now. She says it's not words exactly, more like I'm responding to something, like I'm listening to a voice she can't hear and answering it. I don't remember any of it when I wake up. I don't know what's under that door. I don't know how long it's been there, or what it was before it was there, or whether the bunker was built around it, or it arrived some other way. I don't know if the rules were written to contain it or study it or communicate with it, or some combination of all three, and I don't know who wrote the note in the locker or when they placed it or whether they made it out. What I know is that the door opened, and whatever was on the other side understood what the threshold meant, came to it, tested the edge of the opening at 3:06 in the morning with something that moved the infrared, pressed against the upper concrete frame from inside, left a mark at 15 feet, and then went back down and let the door close. And somewhere in a building I've never visited, someone has 90 days of data, temperature logs, camera feeds, audio records, behavioral patterns. Everything I did, every night, documented and stored and analyzed by people who understood what they were studying far better than I did. I just don't know, still, which subject they were more interested in. Here is what keeps me awake at 3 in the morning. Rule 12. Whatever you think you see on the camera feed after the door opens, remember that the camera does not show everything that is there. For 3 nights, I watched feed 11. I kept my eyes on the screen exactly as the rules required. And the screen showed me the door, the gap, the concrete, the darkness, and nothing crossing the threshold, nothing entering the gravel field. That's what the camera showed me, the camera doesn't show everything that is there. So when I watched that feed and saw nothing cross the threshold, I was seeing the partial picture, the version the technology could capture. And in the complete picture, the one no camera could give me, I have no way of knowing what was present in that facility during those 3 nights. What moved through the darkness outside my window? What existed in the blind spots I didn't know were there? What stood at some point in those 72 hours on the south side of the guard station, in the space the cameras couldn't reach, close enough to the wall to touch it? I've been home for 14 months, and I find myself thinking, on the nights I wake up and lie still in the dark and listen to the house settle, about the fact that whatever is under that door spent 90 days learning my patterns, my rhythms, when I slept and when I was alert, when I moved and when I was still, how I responded to each event, how long I waited, how I breathed. 90 days of one consistent, predictable human presence. And then that presence drove away and went home and resumed its life. I think about what something like that does with 90 days of data, what it knows now that it didn't know before I arrived. Whether that knowledge has an application, whether what I gave it just by being there and being consistent and following the rules was something it needed. And I think about this, the last thing, the thing I can't put down. If the camera didn't show everything that was there during those 3 nights with the door open, then I don't know how many of the other 87 nights I wasn't alone inside that room. I just know I followed the rules, and I know something down there was watching me do it. If there is another contractor out there right now, if for any reason this reaches someone who has just read that list for the first time, standing in front of a locker in the Nevada desert, follow the rules. All of them. Not because they'll protect you. Follow them because whatever is under that door has already been watching you long enough to know exactly what you'll do when you're afraid. And it has been waiting far longer than you have been alive.